1% in the US, 38% UK, and so on. After the government gets involved, the dark blue bars, poverty is cut almost in half in 3 of the countries, right? So the UK, it comes down from almost 40% to 21, Australia from 32% to 17, Canada from 29% to 16. So there's 3 countries where the safety net cuts poverty almost in half. And then there's that one country over there, the US, where our safety net cuts poverty by 5 percentage points, right? So the reason we have more poverty, higher child poverty than other countries is because we have a less active safety net, not because of what's going on in our population composition or what's happening in the market. So we have a less active safety net. We also provide less preschool, which is a pretty relevant factor in early childhood. So at the top of this graph, you can see Australia and the UK, which have universal preschool. So in those countries, enrollment in preschool doesn't vary by family SES. Whereas in the United States, you can see we've got this gradient. So Canada is interesting here. So the Canadians, you might wonder how come they're reading so much and watching so much TV. Well, it turns out their kids aren't in childcare. Their kids are home. So it is kind of a package deal. They've got lots of parental childcare, and they're reading books together, and they're watching TV. So it's interesting how different the model could be when they're not that far away from us. They really are our nearest neighbor. Okay, so by now it should not be a surprise if I asked you in which country do you think achievement is going to be most unequal at school entry? Where are we going to find the biggest SES gaps in school readiness? It should be no surprise that it's going to be most unequal in the United States. And that's in fact the case. So here we're looking at inequality in language and reading skills at school entry. The total height of the bar is the gap between kids whose parents have high education and low education. So in the US, you can see the total height of the bar is 1 standard deviation. So the bottom part of the bar is the gap between kids whose parents have low and medium education. The top half of the bar is kids whose parents have, the gap between kids whose parents have medium and high levels of education. It's about evenly distributed between the two, but mostly I'm going to focus on the total length of the bar, which is a full standard deviation. Sometimes I get asked what that equates to, what that means in real terms, like say maybe months of development, and I try not to answer that question because at kindergarten entry, a standard deviation gap is huge. So it's more than a year of development is all I'll say, because if I told you the real number of months of development, it's too big to be believable. It's like, gasp inducing. So let's just say it's more than a year of development. The other thing to notice in this graph is that the total bars in each of the other 3 countries are significantly lower. You can see the little whiskers on this. Those are the confidence intervals. So inequality, the size of the gaps in the other 3 countries is significantly less in each of the other 3 countries. Okay, the UK is a close runner-up at almost 0.8 of a standard deviation, but Australia and Canada are more like 0.5 or 0.6 of a standard deviation. Okay, so kids in the US not only start out primary school more unequal, they also finish more unequal. So I said we have 3 time points. So at age 5, we actually have both reading and math for the United States. So this graph, I've added the math. It's also a standard deviation gap. Age 7 and 9, again, it's about a standard deviation gap in the States. It continues to be significantly larger than the other countries, and that's age 11. So the picture doesn't get any better. We continue to be the most unequal. The US kids, we can actually follow longer. We can follow the US kids to age 14 in a way that we can't in our other data sets. And that's important to do because if you look back at this graph, you'd say that looks like the age 5. So it looks like all the inequality is already there at school entry, but you can't really assume that just by looking at the levels because there's lots of things going on. There's some measurement error when kids first start school. There should be some regression to the mean among the highest scorers and among the lowest scores. So it's not really right to just compare the size of these gaps. You really want to follow kids over time. So with the US data, we can do that in a very precise way. So what we're doing here is we're taking children who had identical test scores at school entry. So not just similar scores, not just in bins of high, medium, and low, kids who had identical scores. So we could actually have, 100 different or 50 different sets of lines like this. Just to make it clearer, we only have 3 groups here. So we've got children at the top who started kindergarten a full standard deviation above their peers. We've got kids who were right at the mean, at the 0 point, and then we've got kids who start out a full standard deviation behind. And then among those kids, the high achievers, the kids who start out high, they come in 3 varieties. There's low SES, medium SES, and high SES. Now, okay, there's not so many low SES kids who start out high, but there are some. And likewise, there's not so many high SES kids who start out low, but there are some. So we're going to use all the kids that we can. And so if we focus on the high-scoring kids, those kids, our friends, the squares, those kids start out with a high test score and they're high SES. And we can follow precisely those kids through to 8th grade, to age 14. So that's our friends, the squares. Our friends, the squares, start high and they stay high. Yeah? Then there are their little friends who sat right next to them in kindergarten, the little crosses, and they had the exact same test score the day that they started kindergarten. They're exactly the same in terms of their initial ability. And when we've instrumented here, so we've used the fall test scores to instrument for the spring test scores, so we get rid of measurement errors, so we've done all this fancy stuff. But so they really are starting out with the same test scores. That's our little cross kids, except their parents don't have a college education. They're only medium SES. And look what happens to them. They lose ground. They fall off, right? And then the worst are those little triangle kids. These are these little budding stars, right? These little triangle kids, they started out a standard deviation above their peers, above all the peers, right? They're scoring just like the little squares and the little crosses, but they have low educated parents. And look what happens to them, right? They fall way, way down. They're below, they're not even a half a standard deviation above the mean by 8th grade, right? So these kids are pulling apart even though they had the same initial test scores. So it's not just what's happening before school entry, something's happening after school entry. And I've been, emphasizing the high achieving kids, but you can see the same thing for the middle achieving kids. Those lines are pulling apart, and the bottom achieving kids. I mean, luckily, the bottom achieving kids, everybody makes some progress, but the high SES kids make a lot more. So with these kinds of analyses, I mean, we can do it best for the US, but we can do it for 3 of our countries. Canada is kind of hopeless, the data, so we can't do this analysis, but we can do it for 3 of our countries. And so we can portion out how much of the inequality that we see at age 11 was already there at school entry, and how much of it develops subsequent to school entry. And this is the first time we've seen estimates like this. And honestly, if you'd asked us, we would have said, oh, probably about half is there at school entry and about a half develops later, because that's the received wisdom. And actually, there's been a lot of work on this on the black-white test score gap historically, and that was the received wisdom on the black-white test score gap, that about half of it's there at school entry and the other half develops subsequently. So it turns out with these kinds of SES gaps, actually the majority is there at school entry. In the United States, it's 70% is already there at school entry. In the UK, it's almost 60%. In Australia, it's 66%. So I don't think the countries are much different in that respect. I think the message from this is the US is more unequal than the other countries, and a lot of that is arising already in early childhood, before school entry. So this cannot be laid at the door of the schools, right? We cannot blame schools for 70% of this gap because it's happening before kids get to school. So that's pretty important in terms of thinking about policies, right? When we start to think about, well, what can we do about this? So I have no idea how I'm doing for time, but I think I'm actually doing fine, right? Okay. Because we're in the home stretch here, so now we're just like, what can we do about it? So obviously so yeah, I don't mean to make light of what can we do about it. I'll say this book was the result of, the four of us were fellows at Russell Sage for the year. And so we spent the year together, and part of the idea of spending the year together, besides working on harmonizing the data, was that we would go to seminars, we would read things, and we would really get on the same wavelength. And so we had, I think it was a 20-page syllabus of all the research on what you can do to close achievement gaps, which at least I read. I think my co-authors also read it. So we did really work really hard on this, and this is all based in the evidence. So you have to do something in early childhood, right? 70% of the gap is there. It's already at school entry, a standard deviation gap. You have to do something so that kids come in more equally prepared. So I would particularly highlight investing in evidence-based parenting programs. Parenting programs get kind of a bad reputation. There are a lot of them out there that are ineffective, but there are actually a small number that have been proven, and there is a pretty good evidence base. And Ron has a wonderful chapter about this in his book, Show Me the Evidence, so I would definitely direct you there. And then following on the very interesting symposium that was just held in this room, I would invest in universal high-quality preschool for 3- and 4-year-olds, and I base that on the really excellent review that Hiro Yoshikawa led for SRCD and FCD, and on the review that Chris Room and I did of European programs, South American programs, programs outside of the United States, because we wanted to know about the long-run effects. And if you want to know about the long-run effects of universal preschool, you have to look outside the United States, because we haven't had it long enough in the United States. And so I won't, recap that article here, however tempting that is to do, since that evidence was omitted in the last symposium. But I'll just say the evidence, there is long-run evidence, and it's not from developing countries. It's from countries like France, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Uruguay, Argentina. There is evidence, actually, of long-run effects of preschool. So that's what we base this evidence on. Second, I think we have to do something about incomes, and it's incomes in early childhood, but it's also incomes during the school years. So this is something that cuts across the early childhood and the school year period. I think there's now quite good evidence about the causal effects of income on child health and development. I don't think we would have been able to say that even 5 years ago. This was very contested. There was a large associational literature about income and child development, but there's now, it's not many studies, but there's a handful of causal studies that really make this case. So, and we know a lot about, policies to raise incomes for the poor and near poor, increasing the minimum wage, expanding the EITC and the child tax credit, maintaining those maintaining and strengthening the food and nutrition programs, and then, of course, providing supports for working families. We did notice in the book that only one of our 4 countries doesn't have paid family and medical leave. That would be the United States. And we now have pretty good evidence from California, New Jersey, and Rhode Island that we can have paid leave on a social insurance model, and it doesn't hurt employers a bit. Employers are actually perfectly happy with it, and mothers and fathers take it up and use it. And as far as we can tell, there's benefits for kids. We're still learning about the benefits for kids. And then third, if we could wave a magic wand and improve the quality of teaching and learning in schools, that's obviously what we should be doing. This is the one that's, a huge black box. It seemed to us, based on our review of the research on this, and much of it has been presented at APPAM, where really the best research in the country is being showcased here every year. The 3 key elements to us were recruiting, supporting, and adequately compensating more effective teachers, having more rigorous curricula, and setting higher expectations and more support for low-achieving students. If you look at what the effective schools have done, whether they're effective public schools or charter schools, they set higher expectations, they provide more support, and they use rigorous curricula. So we talk a lot in the book about the Common Core. You can also look at a paper by Murnane and Cohen. Here's one of the more depressing graphs from the book. It's probably the most depressing. This is teacher salaries. So in 3 of our countries, teachers are paid about on a par with other workers who have tertiary education, so college plus. UK, they're paid at 99%. Australia, they're up in arms because they're only being paid 92% of what other college-educated workers are being paid. So when I was in Australia earlier this fall, there was a big campaign to raise teacher pay because teachers are underpaid relative, and you can't get highly qualified people in if you're only paying 92% of what the salaries are for college-educated workers, right? And Canada, they overpay, they pay 105%, and then again, look at that one outlier, the United States, right? We're paying teachers 67%, 2/3 of what we pay other workers with college education. So who are we drawing into the teaching sector? We think about recruiting more effective teachers. We're not going to be able to do it with that kind of pay. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think we've seen that children from low SES families face considerable challenges, more so than in the US than in other countries. They're disadvantaged in so many ways. Their parents don't just lack education, but they're also younger, less stable families, lower incomes than the higher SES families who are investing like crazy in their children. Then we have a less active safety net. We don't have paid parental leave. We don't have universal preschool. We don't have reliable income supports. Until recently, we didn't have universal health care. And then we've got these schools that are segregated by income, something that's come up several times today, have unequal school resources, including inputs like teacher quality. So, I mean, these gaps are sobering, but I think they also suggest that we could do better. These countries are not that different from us. I didn't say at the outset, I should have said that we picked these 4 countries deliberately because we wanted to compare like to like. There are 4 similar countries. They've got diverse populations. They've got similar labor markets, somewhat similar welfare states. These are our closest brothers and sisters in the international world. So they're a good case comparison. And if they can do better, we could do better too. I think also, I said at the beginning I was going to come back to these recent trends in the United States. It does look like there's something of a turnaround. And these are from a paper that Sean presented earlier today, and that he also presented very early today at the 7 o'clock breakfast that he was kind enough to do for his Spencer Award lecture. This is the decline in the 90-10 gap in both math and reading over the last few cohorts, and especially looking at the 1998 fall kindergarten entrance versus the 2010 fall kindergarten entrance. This is from the ECLSK, where these cohorts are completely comparable in terms of the data collection, and this is this turnaround. This is this ray of hope that maybe these gaps that Sean documented were rising relentlessly are actually starting to come down. So this has prompted us now to be interested in what's going on and what might explain it. And so we have one paper that Daphne Basak and Ray-Hyuk Lee and Sean and I have completed on this, and we're actually now doing a second paper with Jenna Finch, or maybe they're going to merge and be one big paper. I'm not sure where we are with, so I don't know, it's one paper, it's 2 papers, whatever. And Jenna Finch's name should, I think, now be on this because maybe it's all one paper. So we're looking at what parents are doing. So we see this decline in these achievement gaps, school readiness gaps over the 2 cohorts. Is there something going on with parenting? So each of these graphs is done in the same way. This is parenting activity across the income percentiles. And so obviously reading with your child at least 3 times a week goes up across the income distribution. Using computers is higher at the higher parts of the income distribution. Taking your child to the library is more common on the highest part of the income distribution. But the two different lines reflect the two different cohorts. So the gray cohort, the light cohort, is the 1998 cohort, where you can see the gradient is quite steep. And you can see that in the black line, which is the most recent cohort, you can see that there's convergence, and the convergence is being driven by what's happening at the bottom. It's being driven by what's happening with low-income families. So low-income families are increasing their reading activities with their kids. They're increasing their computer use. And this is specifically, we have a bunch of different measures of computer use. This one is your child using the computer for reading or math? And so you can see this convergence with the increase, especially at the bottom of and middle of the income distribution. And then this is taking your child to the library, which was, less common among the low-income families in the old cohort, and now they've increased their library going quite substantially. Okay, so coming back to the next war on poverty, I know we're all starting to think about, so what's the next war on poverty? What should we be doing? And I think a really important element of that next war on poverty has to be committing to reduce these achievement gaps. These gaps cut across, they underlie the other forms of inequality. I honestly think we're never going to have more equal opportunity in the United States if we don't address these massive gaps between kids whose parents are more and less educated. And the evidence from the last decades in the States and from these other countries suggests that we really can do something about it. We really could do a lot better. So we can provide more support for early